So
Hi.
welcome back, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed your break. In this session, we're going to explore a rather different angle, although we started to have some interesting conversations in the previous session on COVID-19. We're thrilled to have the Good Lobby with us, represented by Professor Alberto Alemano, who will join us in a few minutes. He is the founder and director of the Good Lobby, Kelsey Beltz, who is the head of partnerships and education, and Sarah Mondonesi, who is the public affairs officer. I think the Good Lobby will be known to many of you. It is a citizens-driven lobby network to really spark change in society, fundamental change. And Kelsey and our colleagues will talk us through what lobbying is really about and give us some interesting insights as to how the CV community can advocate for meaningful change. So Kelsey, please feel warmly welcome to this session, and the floor is yours. Over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having us, and we've been really excited for this session. So as she gave us a very warm welcome, we're here to talk about sort of more about influencing policy. And I was able to tune in to part of the last session, which was really amazing because I think it gave us a great segue, which is how can we actually band together? How can we build back better in a way that's sort of like a coalition? And so I'm here today to talk about some things that might seem somewhat abstract, but I hope I can give you some very concrete tools, whatever your level of work is, in ways to actually use your patient voice, which is so important, and to influence policy. So as we've already had a warm introduction, today I will be leading this training. I'm head of partnerships and education at the Good Lobby. I'm also the manager of the Brussels office. We will have our founder and director, Alberto Alemano, joining us soon. And I'm joined today also by our public affairs officer, Sarah Mondonesi, who has a great background in terms of influencing policy as well. So we're very excited to be with you here today. As I've already sort of noted, today we really want to give you some key elements of how you can do an advocacy or lobbying strategy. We'll talk a little bit about some of the influences of those words. We also, because we only have 1 hour together, want to really talk about the big picture. How does this link to this overall Unite Summit? How does this link to your work? It's not supposed to be a university course on lobbying. It's really, how can this apply to things that you, me, we all care about? And then at the end of the day, we want you to turn things you're passionate about into a mission. How do you take something that you're really trying to push forward and actually get it to that next level? So those, in the very short time we have together, are hopefully the 3 things that we will be able to do. So I want to start with an icebreaker that has nothing to do perhaps with heart health or any of the health issues. But let's talk first about the word lobby, because obviously the name of our organization is the Good Lobby. Do you think Greta Thunberg is a lobbyist? And here I'll go to a poll. So I think you should have the option to say either yes or no, and just do the first thing that comes to mind. It doesn't have to be well reasoned. This is really sort of a knee-jerk reaction. So again, this is a hard question, right? Because we want to see yes. So we have a lot of yes, some no. This is just to get the ball rolling. Because let's talk about the definition of a lobbyist, right? That's what we're about to dive into. And here I'm actually very excited to pass the ball to Alberto Alemano, who is joining us now, who is actually the founder and director of the Good Lobby. And he can tell you all about the reasons that we can really sort of dive into whether or not Greta, despite her being a wonderful activist, is indeed a lobbyist. So Alberto, to you, perhaps.
Thank you, Kelsey, and hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yep, we can hear you well.
Well, I think the question is very appropriate because we can start having a conversation around whether Greta Thunberg, she's an activist. Some people might think she's an advocate. Some other people think she's only an activist. I think it's really a matter of whether you, as a patient, you are somehow fitting into one of those specific categories. So next slide, I think will potentially clarify when you go to the concentric circles, Kelsey, you can see that basically all forms of engagement with governments, notably protesting, the very beginning of engaging with governments and public authorities and society is activism. And within that circle, you have a smaller one, which capture the advocacy. And an advocate is a bit more than an activist. It's not only about protesting in the street, it's already about targeting a message to broader society and try to raise awareness, try to mobilize certain segments and different stakeholders. But then within the advocacy circle and that specific activity, we have an activity which isn't more specific, which is about lobbying. This is really about targeting decision makers, trying to influence their decisions by sharing ideas, solutions that bring your work a step further. So based on this conceptual framework that hopefully is going to clarify the different semantics we might use in our daily life, you will see that probably Greta doesn't really qualify as a lobbyist. She's more like an activist. That's how she started out, not going to school on Friday. And then she became an advocate, raising awareness, meeting more and more in different communities. And now she might be beginning to be a lobbyist, but she's not really pushing forward for specific solutions, like pushing on, how to solve the major difficult questions with the ecological transition, which is who is going to pay? What about the distributed consequences stemming from a carbon tax, right? Everybody wants a carbon tax, but nobody wants to pay for it. So the question is really how we can help decision makers in addressing those trade-offs. This is the job of the lobbyist. It's not necessarily the job of the advocates or the activists. The next slide, I don't really see the slides here well.
Yeah, so the next slide I wanted to mention because we have a very global audience, which is fantastic. But one of the things that we've seen even within Europe, which is where most of our work is that sometimes we don't even really know what we mean by the word lobby. And in some languages, they actually use the English word lobby. So this was just an example to say that if you're in a country where you say, oh, I really don't like lobbying, or I've never even heard the word lobbying, it's to say that it's a phrase that's very sometimes not understood, which is why we wanted to break down those circles. But it's also to say what we're about to share with you is our definition of lobbying, which is the definition that comes from the dictionary. But we also recognize that depending on the context, you may want to go forward and not necessarily use the word lobbying. Perhaps you want to use the word advocacy, or perhaps you are just about to sprinkle the word lobbying into your daily work. But this is just to say that we recognize the fact that in some ways it's a very sort of interesting topic because in many countries we're not totally sure what it means. But with all of that said, I'll pass it back to Alberto to say how we define lobbying.
Yeah, I think over time we realized that lobbying really carries a negative connotation, but it shouldn't. Because if you think about lobbying is only about voicing your preferences with decision makers. So is you caring about something and letting decision makers know about it by sharing ideas and holding them accountable on their promise to you on how to solve the specific issue. So our mission is really to demystify lobbying as a legitimate form of participation that anybody should be allowed to do. And we really think that democracies need more lobbying as opposed to less lobbying, because if you have more lobbying, it means that you have people caring about what public policy making is doing for them and for society. So the major elements and the major ingredients you need in order to come up with these lobbying recipes is to have some attempts by anyone to persuade through influence some specific decision making. In general, the lobbying is oriented towards the adoption of a policy or the reform of a policy or the suspension of a policy, but is always about changing the rules of the game. So if you're in that space, you're a lobbyist. If you are simply about creating the need for such a policy change, you're probably an advocate. And that's, I think, is the best definition of what Greta is doing. But we also see a sense of missed opportunity. What if the Fridays for the Future in your own movement become more a lobbyist than an advocate? This is a qualitative change, because instead of simply pushing for some social norms to change, you're trying to translate this into the policy cycle. And we all know that the quality of the life we have and the various opportunity we have is very much conditioned by those rules of the game. So focus on the rules means triggering what we call systemic change. And the system change is a change of the system that applies to everyone, also for those who haven't shown up, who are not born yet. And this is what probably differentiates a lobbyist from a general advocate. And that's why it's important to have clear-cut ideas on the differences between lobbying as a phenomenon advocacy, and activists. At the same time, it's a matter of degree. So you can be an activist. And I think many patients are, many people involved in the patient movement are activists, but they're also advocates and they're also lobbyists. And I think it's possible to wear the three at the same time. But this, of course, requires professionalization, requires a full understanding of the repertoire of tools required to actually meet and lobbying and to change social norms and the rules of the game. So this is the definition we propose to you that comes from Cambridge University, from the legal English dictionary, but is also the way of looking at things without biases in today's polarized world.
Yes, thank you so much, Alberto. I mean, I think that's a wonderful rallying cry for what we're about to sort of dig into for the next hour. But for those of you who might be saying, listen, I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not even an advocate, I'm here, of my own volition, don't panic, because we're really here to talk to each and every one of you about how you can actually do policy change. So if all of this sounds very foreign, please don't worry. If it sounds very in line with what you're already doing, we're very excited to hear from you. But let's all get excited for the next hour. And thank you again, Alberto, for that introduction. So I will dig in then to why exactly we're called the Good Lobby, which might sound in some ways kind of silly, but the idea is exactly what Alberto said, which is it's to balance out some of these sort of what we perceive as negative influences, but in a way that is doing exactly what he just defined, which is advocating or trying to create a policy change that you believe in. So we do that by enhancing the advocacy capacity of civil society, which is through activities like this one. It's also to promote more responsible corporate lobbying. There may be people in the room who are working for groups that are corporations, that are working for groups that are hospitals. That's fine. I mean, we're not here to demonize, so to speak, those who are working on more private sector issues. Exactly what we're trying to do is to say that we should all be working together, whether we're an NGO, whether we are a medical professional, or whether we're a corporation, because ideally we should all be working towards the same goals. And as I said, to do that, we do trainings to demystify lobbying. We work on a regulatory framework to make it more democratic, and we try to promote more responsible corporate lobbying. Why do we do this? Why did we start working on lobbying? As he already hinted at, lobbying is a legitimizer. It's not something that's bad. It's not something that you sort of do under the covers. It's something that is encouraged, right? It's really, we should all be actively engaging with our policymakers. It's part of what makes democracy wonderful. So not only is it allowed, it's not illegal, it is encouraged. I should preface this by saying it's encouraged in a way that's ethical and transparent. Of course, we're all working in a system that we hope is ethical and transparent. Yes, and as we said, what we're going to dive into today is that some people don't know about these avenues. They don't know how to engage. We think of lobbyists and we think of big tobacco, or we think of some of these other things, but that's not necessarily the whole story. It's a mobilizer. How many of us have signed just a petition on change.org or a vase, and we sign it and we don't think about it ever again? It's not to say that we're bad people. I mean, we all want to engage, but we're busy. We have our daily life. We have all of the other things we're doing. So lobbying is one way to take your sort of daily engagement and really take it beyond that and actually say, how can I change this policy? How can I make a political impact? And I think that's super crucial. The other way, which is perhaps the biggest way when we talk about the connotations of lobbying, is it's an equalizer. There are going to be groups that are lobbying, whether we do it or not, right? As NGOs, we can throw up our hands, we can say we don't think this is ethical, but there are always going to be people that are lobbying, specifically people with a bunch of skills and a bunch of money. So what we try to do really is to say, as an organization, how can I try to use the same tools to actually counter this influence? And if we don't have as much money, we might not have the same policy change. But at the end of the day, we need to use the same tools that everyone else is using, because that's the only way really we're going to have some form of voice, whether you're a patient advocate, whether you're a climate advocate. We need to really be able to harness these tools, which are publicly available, which are available to all of us. And that's the way we make our voices heard, whether it's against organizations, whether it's against governments, or whether it's with and for organizations and governments. We all need to be using the same tools. And finally, this one is a little slightly controversial, but we like to say it. It's not necessarily that we want businesses or money to have less influence. Of course, we would like them to be acting through ethical channels, through transparent channels. That makes the ground more level. But at the end of the day, we want to really amplify civil society. We want to amplify other voices. It's about having every voice heard. And this is a part where I'll be very eager to hear some of your questions, which we will have time for at the end of this session, and then again at the very, very end. Because I know there's always people who are saying, how can you not think that we should have less voices from business? But the idea really that we believe in is that there should be this sort of pluralistic view. Everyone should be contributing, but also in a way that makes it fair. And that is why we created the Good Lobby. So here's a poll, since I just gave you lots of information. And so I'd like to know if any of you in the audience sort of currently engage with policymakers for your work or activity. This could be that it's your job. It could also be that sometimes you write a letter. It could be lots of different things. And so I think there's a poll going out, and it can be creative. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to be working on policy. Maybe there's something you do that in some way engages. Maybe you are engaged in a community project. Maybe you have talked to a policymaker. It can be very, very broad. And I'll give it maybe one more minute, and then we can look at the results all together. And again, it could be at a local or national. Some of us think always that politics is happening and somewhere very far away from us, but it could even be you interacting with a mayor, you having a say in something that's happening in your region. So really be creative, because many more of us are interacting with policymakers than we think. Okay. So results are in. Okay, so a bit of a mixed bag, right? There's a lot of people working sort of at the local level, which is normal, which is very important as well. Not everything happens at an international level. And actually a lot of things that happen at an international level are because there's already local or regional or national things happening. And then some no, which is great, because if we were all sitting here sort of as a giant group of people that were already influencing policy, then you would all be teaching me and none of us would have anything to learn. So that's exactly the type of sort of mixed response that I'm hoping for. And I don't mean it to discourage anyone. Again, the point of this is really to sort of to get you thinking about the ways you could interact. So it's just good to sort of know the temperature that's in the room. Which leads me to my last point, which is that lobbying makes you humbler. And I can speak to this from a very personal level. I joined also coming from a very regional perspective. I was born and raised in Colorado. I was working on things in my hometown. And then when I started trying to work on bigger things, at first I was very discouraged. And I was saying, there's no way I'm ever going to make a difference at this level. And I don't know what I'm doing. And I started seeing in some ways the trade-offs, which at first was not particularly pleasant, because of course you want to walk into the room, you want to have this massive policy win. And in the end, that's not really how it works. But I think there's a value to seeing the trade-offs. There's a value to seeing the process, because it also shows some transparency, and that it's not always necessarily the elected officials that are doing a bad job, but there's a whole process behind it that merits sort of looking at it. And it's not necessarily the best part about lobbying, but it is an important part. And I think it's valuable for all of us to see the policy process. And then last but not least, of course, it's good for democracy. I mean, it's the way that we can engage between elections. We want to have a society that's listening to citizens. We want to have a society that's listening to what people are saying. And of course, it's a good first step to vote, I would say. All of us hope we're voting all the time, but politics happens in between elections, right? We don't vote and walk home and then never think about politics again. And some people don't realize that you can actually engage with policymakers in between these elections. So that's part of what we're really trying to emphasize here, is the idea that politics is happening every day. You do have a voice, and whether it be regional, whether it be national or international, these are the types of things that we should all be thinking about. And especially linking to the last panel, we're living in a world, I mean, it was always interconnected, but with COVID, with all of these issues, now is the moment. We cannot necessarily put our head under the pillow, and we want to join together. But what I'm hoping is these can give you some tools to join together. It can give you some tools to make your voice heard, because this is definitely a moment where we need to be thinking about our impact. So as I just led into, let's pause here. I'm not sure if we want to see if there's any questions leading up to that, perhaps. I'll let Olive sort of filter them. No questions. Okay, great. So now we will do what I just said, which is sort of diving into the tools. This is a very, very brief overview of this. I will note, because you have the online platform. So what we've done in the online platform is we've shared a resource, which is called the Guide to Citizen Lobbying. And in the Guide to Citizen Lobbying, there's much more details on every single thing that I have spoken about today. And it also is a breakdown of some of these tools. So I will not ask you to memorize these 10 steps. What I'm really showing you at this moment is that there are the good lobby methodology, and these are some steps that we recommend for people that are trying to have sort of a policy change. So what we're going to focus, it goes all the way from picking your cause, which I think many of you probably already have a cause, and then it goes through doing your homework, coalition building, fundraising, which is of course essential, all the way through meetings and then monitoring. So rather than going through all of these steps today, what I will do is I'm going to focus on these three, but I will emphasize again that the resources that are uploaded are very helpful. They're available to all of you. And then if anyone has any questions, or for instance, you would like to explore one of these steps further, I will include my contact information at the end. So it'll be very open. It'll be very accessible. The first step might sound kind of obvious: do your homework, because honestly, I cannot emphasize enough how important research is. And a lot of you are probably working in an area where you're doing a lot of research. You're doing a lot of research on particular causes. Perhaps you have a real sort of like a lot of data on things you're working with. But the research also includes doing things like mapping out who to speak to. It includes things like understanding the landscape. So it sounds kind of funny, and it sounds like I'm speaking to high schoolers when I say homework, but honestly, it's something I think about every day. Every time I open a new policy that I'm working on, the first thing I do, I Google everyone involved in it. I Google all of the sort of forces involved in it. And you really have to do a very solid sort of review. Which brings me to the part that's most important, which is actually listing your key stakeholders. And a lot of us think of our stakeholders as people that are directly involved in one of our particular causes, but there's actually a huge range of stakeholders, right? There's people that are allies, there's people we can phrase as opponents, but maybe they're actually going to come back to us. And then there's also influential actors, people who might not directly relate to us, but they're actually shaping the environment in which we're working. So what I would emphasize is to think about this really diverse range of backgrounds and to sort of move beyond many of us think of stakeholders as who am I meeting with, who am I emailing with, who are these people in my direct ecosystem? But we really need to think about the bigger ecosystem. So I would say think about mission. Funding is huge. Think about who's giving them money. Demographics, are they old? Are they young? Are they in Western Europe? Are they in Argentina? I mean, these things matter because lots of us think of these big issues, for instance, cardiovascular issues. They're very global, global warming, very global, but you need to really break it down piece by piece to think directly, who are my stakeholders? And then again, geography, because you won't have one stakeholder map for every single area. You need to be really targeting your outreach. And then again, because we have a global audience, your stakeholder map might look very different depending on your region. So I tend to work in Europe, so I have one sort of set of stakeholder maps, but depending on where you are, it could be seriously different, because at the end of the day, the people that are pulling the strings sort of on your stakeholder maps are people of influence. So in some regions, the church or other religious groups could have a huge influence, right? They might actually be in some ways the people that you would want to reach out to. In other places, civil society organizations, whether they can be sort of loosely formed, whether they're formal, whether they revolve around schools, they can have a huge influence on where you're working. And influencers, we tend to think of people who are on Instagram, taking pictures, but influencers are actually much broader. Whoever is in your local community who sort of has a very broad reach could be considered an influencer. So it's good to think about unconventional actors. It's not just businesses or NGOs or politicians. I mean, look back at your own work, look back at your own goals, and think who actually has sort of the power to be forwarding these goals. And then this is a very basic version of how I would actually say you could map your stakeholders, which is to say it's an axis. You can print it out, you can do it on PowerPoint, you can do it with sticky notes, but the main takeaways are the idea that you sort of at the top axes, you have more power. At the bottom, you have less. And then you have oppose change, support change. It may sound really basic, but it's an extremely helpful thought exercise to actually put them on paper. I do this for every single thing I'm working on, to actually sort of put everything on paper or on PowerPoint and really, really examine them is very helpful. Because you can see who is really in your court and who's not. And what I would say is more important is actually to look at people who are sort of in the middle, because those are the people that you're trying to actually influence, right? There's a very little chance that if someone is very strongly opposing you, unless you have the world's best campaign, they might not move over into supporting change. But if there's people in the middle who maybe have moderate power and maybe they're kind of on the fence about supporting you, those are the people you want to target, right? Those are the people you want to move into your support system. They're the ones you want to move into your allies. And those are the people I would say that you should really be focusing on. The reason we say ignore anyone in the lower left quadrant is not because we don't think it's important, but we're all working probably with limited resources, right? We're either patient advocates, we're individual advocates, we're working for NGOs. So it's not to say you shouldn't pay any attention to people in that quadrant, but if you're focusing your policy goals on something, it's probably better to focus on people with either who are supporting you or who have a bit of a higher power. Again, I would say probably better to break these maps into subjects. It's very rare you're going to have one stakeholder map for every single issue, but this is a very valuable exercise, and we work with this a lot with different groups that we work with. I think that even the act of mapping can be really, really helpful. And to give you a quick example of the map, which again is a little bit Euro focused, and it's very, very sort of broad because it's, again, it would be very hard to map attitudes towards plastic on one map, but this was an attitude towards plastic. So you can see in the upper right quadrant, of course, Greenpeace, there's countries that are more progressive, Scandinavian countries on plastic. There's Plastic Free Ocean, which has a little bit less power necessarily than countries itself. And then on the left-hand side, we see all of the classic people. So Carrefour, Auchan, those are supermarkets in Europe. We have all of the sort of regulars who use a lot of plastic. So this is just to give you an example of how you could perhaps map things. Again, it's quite broad and I would normally split this, but this is just to show how you could kind of think of allies or people who oppose change. Here I will pause again, since that was a little bit, perhaps there may be questions related to that. I'll let Olive see if there's questions. If not, don't worry, we have a whole Q&A session. I just don't want to give you so much sort of information all at once without pausing. So Olive, I'll see if there's questions, and if not, we can keep going. How dynamic should the mapping be? That's actually an awesome question, because the whole point of doing a stakeholder map is to make it dynamic. So she asked, should it be, if the environment is dynamic, how dynamic should the map be? It's very hard to have a map unless you're very good at PowerPoint that actually moves the dots. But the idea is that you would be revisiting these maps, right? Because you would do an initial mapping, which showed people's perspectives. But the whole reason we do this is to see maybe we can influence some of those, again, perhaps at the middle, to come over to our side. Or maybe something happens. Maybe there's a policy decision. For instance, maybe there's something that really impacts groups working in plastics, and some people actually move to the other side. Now there's more people who oppose change. Maybe the Fit for 55 comes through the EU, or maybe there's a legislation in the United States. So that it's a very dynamic environment. So what I would really encourage would be not only to do one mapping per subject, but also to regularly revisit, because a map does not stay the same. Either it's for 1 month or 2 months or 6 months. The idea is that it would be moving. So a very good point to say that you should be regularly revisiting. And if your map is for some reason not moving, it probably means that maybe your influence outreach is not going the way that you hope. How to do this research? Yes, again, practical advice. So there's lots. What I would say to begin with, there's a lot of now accountability in certain regions, certainly in Europe and the United States. Certain groups have to list specifically their sponsors on their website. Often they list their policy work on their website. But again, as we all know, you're probably not going to find the full story on their websites. So there are some online organizations, which I can list in a follow-up email. For instance, in the EU, there's the legislative train, which sort of shows all of the different legislation that's coming down the pipeline. There's also Integrity Watch, which can show you who is meeting with who. It can show you which person is meeting with different organizations and why. And then in the United States, there's also the equivalent, which is Open Secrets. I will send you all of these in a follow-up email, so please don't worry through Olive. But Open Secrets can show you, again, who's funding who, who's meeting with who. None of these are perfect, of course, because as much as we advocate for transparency and sort of accountability, there's no perfect system in place. But some of these watchdogs can give you a more rounded opinion. So what do they say on their website? Who are their sort of public partners? You can do your general desk research. Another thing I would say to activate would be Google Alerts, which sounds really basic. But I'm a professional, and until about 3 years ago, I didn't think to set Google Alerts for things, but they basically do free media monitoring, and you can set it specifically for your region and your language. So you can set Google Alerts for a specific topic, such as plastics, or, well, that's a little broad, but such as sustainable corporate governance. And you can set them, and then you have free advice coming into your inbox every single morning. It shows you the articles with those key terms. You can tailor it by language. And of course, it depends on what's public and not public, but it can actually catch a lot of things that perhaps as busy individuals we wouldn't necessarily catch. So I recommend just looking A, at the websites, B, at the publicly available data that I will share with you, and then C, absolutely just setting Google Alerts. At the end of the day, it's a very cool tool. Does the mapping process help you bring groups together that have common goals? It can, again, so people that have common goals would be those in the upper quadrant on the right? So those would be your allies. And I think a nice thing to do, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is sort of how to map your allies, how to reach out to your allies, how do you talk to partners? So of course, mapping can bring those into reality, right? Because you see who's in support of your goal. At the same time, mapping is more of an internal tool, but what we're about to talk about, if there are no further questions, is actually exactly that. So it's how to engage people for your cause and how to really reach out to coalitions and partners and all of that. Are there any other questions? Was that enough? I'll say a few more things in terms of help you bring groups together. Yes. So the mapping is very much an exercise you do for yourself. But what you'll do after that is if you do a very good mapping, maybe you discover a couple groups who are working on things that you didn't even realize. And then that's a perfect opportunity. You can even show them the map, right? You can come to them and say, we're very aligned on this one policy issue, but look at all of these groups who are perhaps less aligned, or look at this specific issue, and would you like to sort of engage together? Opposition mapping is worth doing to think about what arguments and routes to influence they will use. Yes, absolutely. Rather than to directly engage or persuade them. I think this is, more of a comment, but yes. So opposition mapping, yes. It's not necessarily that you need to go run to your opposition and try to persuade them, because that would actually probably not work, right? It's more about knowing what you're up against at a policy level. Because I think sometimes we all have rosy glasses and we only think about our allies. It's definitely not to say that then, for instance, I work a lot on migration. So when I do a policy map, it's not necessarily to say that I'm going to run to people who are working for Frontex and present them with my policy issue, right? It's much more to say that it's good to know what is happening that might interfere with your policy plan. So if you have a policy plan to advance a health goal, you have a policy plan to advance something, you want to know what potential roadblocks are in your way. And the way to know those roadblocks is to know the actors involved. It doesn't necessarily mean passing the olive branch or even necessarily engaging with them, but you want to know what information the other side may use, because that will tailor then your strategy as an organization or as a patient or as any type of advocate. We always want to know the argument the other person is going to use. And that's really why you do this sort of opposition mapping. It's also why we say not to pay attention to the people who don't have a lot of power, because if we wasted all of our breath on people who don't have power, we would never get anything done. But if there's someone who's powerful, who is potentially going to interfere with something that you are engaging with, you would like to know what they're going to say. Exactly. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to start sending, postcards to every single person who's in your opposition, but it's best to have the full picture. And another question coming through is, how do you know what the world looks like from the decision maker's perspective rather than your own? I think that's very much the $1 million question, right? Because we're all doing this as activists. I think that's also sort of a testimony to doing good homework and a good stakeholder map. As I said, this is a very basic stakeholder map. If you were doing it for one specific policy that was passing with plastics, it would not look like this. And I would say if you can do your research well enough, you have somewhat of an idea of what the decision maker's perspective is, because they are basically sitting at the top of this map, and they are having all of the different sort of inputs from people from every single quadrant, every single level of influence, all flowing into them. So the better you can map, it might not be perfect. There will always be people who are sort of having meetings or maybe not reporting things, but the more thorough you can map and the more thorough you can understand what types of inputs and what types of positions groups are taking from across sides, the more of an idea you're going to know what the policymaker is actually looking at, because they're, in theory, impartial. So they're taking inputs from all across the sides. So the better you can map those inputs and see all the different perspectives, the more you know how to actually orient yourself. Does the type of mapping noted here need to be integrated into a change management strategy? Yeah, I mean, change management is always a part of sort of continuous growth, right? So I wouldn't say that the stakeholder mapping translates directly into change management, but if you're working on an issue that's highly political and you see how different actors are sort of adapting, and to lead into the last question, how actors are feeding into policy outputs, it might make you change, for instance, your theory of change. If you have a theory of change that is, I'm going to do X about cutting carbon emissions, and this policy professional is going to listen to me because he is working on the carbon emissions packet, and you see that he's listening to all these other inputs and he doesn't actually care at all about reducing, you're going to have to change your theory of change. Or if your theory of change is related, for instance, to heart issues, and you think if I can get, X number of signatures, this person has made a pledge to reduce his funding to sugar. But then you see in your stakeholder mapping that he's heavily funded by sugar. That to me would make me pivot. It's not necessarily that it needs to feed directly, but it all comes down to having a sort of holistic understanding of what is going on in the policy environment, and then being able to sort of, incorporate that into either A, how you're planning your strategies, or B, how you're thinking about your theory of change. In an ideal world, it doesn't change, but there might be surprises along the way, which is why we do this sort of robust mapping. And yes, it's always good, again, to have continuous sort of dynamic change, dynamic feedback, and to be responsive. I think some of the policy goals that don't work out are because they're not responding to how things are changing on the ground. So I would definitely underline being agile, readjusting your stakeholder maps, looking at surprises, and then readjusting your theory of change. All of these things need to be dynamic, because if they're not, you might get left behind. Thank you for these great questions. I hope they're being thoroughly answered, and if not, we'll have some more time. Okay. Well, for the moment, then I think we'll continue if there's no more questions. But I also, as I said, we'll have more time at the end. And again, I think I just said most of this in response to the questions, but research, know the moving parts, know what you're trying to explore, and know who your potential sort of opponents are. Planning, the moment to sort of engage with a certain policy is definitely not when it's already being debated, right? You want to be actually sort of setting the scene. You want to be involved when the stakeholders are actually deliberating. You don't want to be involved at the very end. And then targeted outreach. Know your stakeholders, know who's for you, know who is against you. Knowledge is everything. And I know that's probably not a very sort of revolutionary term or a very revolutionary concept to you, but I just can't emphasize it enough, because I think we all end up in our sort of silos when it comes to policy. And we're very much focused on our things, but if you don't have the broad picture and you don't have the planning and anticipation, it's very hard to get somewhere. And I think we already had questions, so I'm not sure if anyone has any lingering ones, or if we can move on. I think we can mostly move on, and I'll leave it up to Olive. If you have any other questions, we can put them in the chat. But now I'm going to take a step back because I think the first part of the session was a little technical. There might be some of you who are saying, oh, I don't even know what I'm doing here, like why I'm not engaging, which is totally fine. As I said, we have a mixed group, which is awesome. And if I was only preaching to people that were policy experts, then I would not really have much of a job. So now I would actually like take a step back. And I know you spent the last session really talking about, COVID and how the system has changed. And so now I'd like to think about, okay, we have kind of the tools. Hopefully we had a bit of a discussion about some of the sort of nitty gritty, not very fun things, which are things like stakeholder mapping. Let's talk about the bigger cause. I mean, why do we do any of this, right? Why do we sit down and do a stakeholder map? It's not because it's a passion of ours. It's because we have this thing that we care about so much as a patient, as an advocate, and we want other people to care, which is really about turning it into a common mission. So I'd like to back up a little bit to the last session, which I saw ending, which is, there are pros, there are cons, there's so much to say about COVID in terms of the public health space. And so one big question, and I've talked about this with groups who I've worked with for the last year throughout the entire sort of ebbs and flows of the pandemic, which is how do you actually maintain attention on your cause during this pandemic? Whether you're working in health, I work with groups who are not working in health, but how do you focus attention on cardiovascular disease, on cardiovascular issues when you're in this atmosphere that is totally saturated with COVID, which of course is linked to cardiovascular issues, but it's not necessarily front and center. And I won't even take the time necessarily to go through all of this because we've all lived through the pandemic. I'm sure we're all very well aware of all of the implications that it had. I think we're all sort of biting our nails at this moment to see what's coming. But again, it's sort of an unprecedented time, right? So there's all of these issues, be they health, be they political, that are coming up. So what can we learn from this as advocates? So I'll ask you another poll. And this I'm genuinely curious because I ask this a lot and I have totally different results. So please just let me know. Do you think COVID-19 has brought more or less attention to your cause, whether it's a personal cause, a political cause, at work or not, whatever you're passionate about, whatever brought you to register here today? Do you think it got more or less or unchanged attention during the COVID pandemic generally? Perfect. Yeah, I'll give you a few moments to answer, but it's very interesting to see. And it does also vary by country, and also by context, right? So I've heard very diverse answers. For some of us, it's way more present. For some of us, we can't get a meeting at all. So I'll be very curious to see you within the cardiovascular community. Yes, let's see the results. Okay, so we can see them sort of loading. It seems pretty split, right? And this is one of the reasons I asked that question, because it's very varied. It's very divided even within the health community. Sometimes I ask this to people who are working in various on various issues, but even within we can see it's almost evenly split, right? So some are more, some are less. And I think in some ways, this is one of the most interesting things to come out of COVID is why and how can we actually sort of harness this? What I would do generally as a follow-up would be to ask where people are joining from. But I think on this particular platform, it's a little bit complicated because I think it's also varying by region. There might be some countries where it's quite more attention and some less. But it would definitely be something I think when we get to the final Q&A session, if you have a particular story or maybe a question you want to ask or something that's linked to this, I think it's super, super interesting. And we would be happy to maybe discuss a little bit more. So for the moment, yeah, great to see that it's almost split because that's why I asked the question. And when we have time at the end, let's really maybe dig into that to see why it might be split. And this might seem related. You might say this is the exact same question, but it's actually not the exact same question. So the difference between having attention on your cause and actually getting a meeting with a policymaker is super different. For instance, you can work in a cause, again, I work on migration. So I can have a cause that's really in the news a lot, but no one wants to meet with me. So this is part of why I'm asking this question. So for those of you, again, it might not be everyone, for those of you who have been trying to actually sort of secure a meeting with policymakers, whether it's local, regional, national, I'd be very curious to hear if you've had an easier or a harder time. And if there's some of you who are saying, I haven't even tried, totally fine. But for me, it's very interesting, and it will lead into some of what we're chatting about. Is it easier or harder if you can do it on Zoom? Is it harder if you can't knock on that person's door? Or is it easier because you don't have to be there? So I'll let her open the poll, and we'll wait a few moments. So yes, of course, there's a bit of, it's obviously a percentage of people who are saying, I haven't even tried. Not many of us necessarily email our local senator or member of parliament, which is totally fine. But for those who do, I'm curious, and I see that there's definitely sort of a tendency to say that it's harder, which to me is very interesting, because it was pretty split. If we look back at the last poll, we were saying, okay, we're pretty split in terms of attention, right? So why then is it sort of disproportionately harder to get a meeting with policymakers? And that comes down, as we've been sort of hinting at, to some of these political tools that hopefully we can give you. I'll give it a minute or two. Yeah. So a lot of us haven't tried, but yes, overwhelmingly harder. Partially, which has to do with being online, but it's a very interesting thing to sort of take stock of, and to think about, okay, so if I'm not necessarily getting meetings with policymakers, how can I engage? So I'm going to be an optimist, because I'm an eternal optimist, to say that in some ways, COVID has actually, especially for health-related issues, given us some opportunities, which is to say that you can come in as a health professional and there's a little bit more either budget or political willpower to be working on health issues. As we've said, though, those are often limited to COVID itself. What I would say is also to take advantage of people that are listening now to health issues. You might have someone who really never cared about health ever before, but now they're wearing a mask and they're worried about their health. And if they are in some way impressionable to learning about cardiovascular health, to learning about risks, I mean, that can actually help. And by diversifying your audience, you can actually get more leverage politically. If we somehow now manage to reach out to several 100,000 people and make them more sensitive about their health, the policymakers will eventually listen. And then, of course, establishing relationships, which is to include donors, which is to include these groups that we're always trying to reach out to. The idea is, yes, it's not always necessarily focused 100% on cardiovascular health, but at least at the moment, it might be a way to say, here are the implications of COVID and certain side effects. Here are the implications of all these things. But what I would really emphasize here is the idea that we have a sensitive audience. We have people who are actually worried about health. And so if we can find a way to reach out to them in a way that's engaging, in a way that's interesting, then that actually is a huge opportunity. It's not to say there aren't negatives, which is to say that, people are very focused on COVID, but let's try to keep it at least minimally positive. I still think that in some ways it's a unique moment, whether it's health or otherwise, to actually engage with policymakers. Again, we already went through this. So now I'll very briefly touch on media outreach and meetings, which I think most of you are probably quite good at. I could give a separate training on decision makers, but for the moment, let's just talk about what we were seeing with the stakeholder mapping, which is allies. And it relates to the question that we had, which is, okay, so maybe we did our nice, beautiful stakeholder map. How do we actually then reach out to our allies if we've mapped them? So we'll start with the general public, and then we'll go to allies. Again, I won't go through this in super intense detail, but it's always good to have these 5 questions for your campaign strategy, even if you're a veteran campaigner. Who, it might sound really silly, but your audience is generally not going to be every single person on the globe. So again, thinking back to demographics, age, what they're working on, it's always good to tailor. What, we'll get into this in more detail, but if you're working on sort of technical health issues, this can actually be the biggest question. We're not going to show up and give them, a 500-page dossier on all of our data on health issues, or we're not going to show up and give them this very intense narrative that is totally coming from the heart. So you need to have a sort of balance of what do I share and with who, and it probably looks different depending on your audience. Where will the communication take place? Is it on Facebook? Is it in person? Is it in a supermarket? Why am I making this presentation? It sounds like very silly, but it's good to revisit also your sort of theory of change, as we also reference, why am I actually pitching to these people? And then how, which is of course the $1 million question. And it comes back to all of these first 4, how am I actually going to access them? What is the best way? And I'll keep this very brief, but again, the mix between attention grabbing and empathy is very important. How do I balance this need to have this very scientific base and this very, health base with also being accessible, with having people who are not necessarily in my camp understanding. And of course, we want it to be participative. Here, I'm going to use an example. As you all know, we're with Global Heart Hub, but they had actually a wonderful example that I think also feeds very well into our chat about COVID, which is when your heart says so, just go. And the idea of this was very patient to patient. It's people who have already experienced these issues saying, when your heart is saying something, you really need to go, because your heart is a muscle, right? Your heart is something that actually is speaking to you. And it's even more relevant in the COVID context when people are saying to stay home. So part of this was patients speaking to other patients saying, trust what you're feeling. Take it from me, who's also gone through these issues. And even though, of course, we all want to respect COVID measures, if you're feeling something that's truly a cardiovascular issue, the best thing you can do, the best way you can protect your heart, is to listen to that and to go. And why this is such a powerful campaign is partially because it has the great slogan, and the just go is very visual, but you can see they've translated it into multiple languages. It's very relevant also, as I said, to the time, but the idea is that, listen to your heart, listen to what your body is telling you from patient to patient, because you'll avoid much bigger issues if you go. But I think especially during the stay from home, this is sort of a powerful perspective. And then for another one is the the World Heart Federation's sort of Global Heart Day, because I think they've done a really good time of showing some of the social media things. So you can see they have the purpose, which has lots of different things, the sort of the headline, which looks like a newspaper headline, the testimonial where they have patients speaking, the hashtag. So this is an example which some of you are probably familiar with, that is sort of more all-encompassing in terms of the sort of social media aspect, the numbers. And this is something that's reinvigorated every year, but this is just another example from the heart world of sort of the types of campaigns you could launch to sort of engage people. And I'm just coming back very quick. Hold on. I'm just coming back very quickly before we talk about allies to look at the poll questions in the chats, which is that it makes a difference where you live at the beginning of COVID, and that, yes, politicians have ignored some of their constituents, too concerned about elections. I mean, I'm totally agree. And this is the crux of the issue. And I think, honestly, no matter where you live, I don't think there was any region that didn't have politicians thinking a lot about themselves and not necessarily about their constituents. But I think the interesting way is, again, how we can engage, because I think in some ways there have been ways to put health back on the forefront and saying we really need these things urgently. And then in some countries it's been sort of left behind. So it's definitely not to say that everyone is having a similar COVID experience or that politicians are necessarily listening more. But I think an interesting way to say would be, how has it been handled in my country? I'm sure you can hear from my accent, I'm American. I'm working in Europe, but I will not say that America has exactly done the best job at managing COVID. And one thing I would like from my country would be to have COVID lead us into a more universal health system. But in order to do that, we need to have groups and individuals like myself pushing politicians towards that moment. It doesn't mean they'll listen, but it means that would be my major goal when I'm targeting. That would be what I would be doing my stakeholder map, is who is for universal healthcare, who's anti-universal healthcare. When I'm targeting my message, how can I then structure it around that message? So of course, we're all living in very different realities, but one overwhelming thing is that COVID has changed all of our lives, whether it's for the better or the worse. And so targeting your message appropriately is important. Which leads me again back into this issue of, pitching to potential partners. So maybe I find this amazing organization that's working in the United States, or this amazing organization in France where I live, and I've mapped them on my nice, beautiful stakeholder map. How then do I go talk to these policymakers who probably have, 100 things to do and aren't necessarily thinking about this every single day? And this is where I think when it really comes down to health issues, it's very important. Is that it's very important to have data. Not everyone will listen, unfortunately. I wish that all the policymakers would listen to data, but it needs to be in a way that's palatable. So one thing that's amazing, I would say, would be a fact sheet. Take the key points from whatever point you're trying to make and put it into a one-page sheet whether it be a leaflet or a PDF. Take the key points with some good footnotes, but condense it, because very few people, when people are taking multiple meetings, it's very unlikely that they're going to be reading through, 20 pages of data. So the data is important, but let's think about it in a way that's palatable. And then at the same time, of course, we're here as advocates, we're here as patients, we're here as people who are really living through things. So it's not to say you need to throw that perspective out the window. It's quite the opposite. I mean, there's a unique perspective that comes from actually living through these things, that comes from working through these things, that there's no leaflet and there's no poster that's going to actually be able to either replicate that or to put that outside. So the balance is essential. And I think that what's really amazing is, again, to have these perspectives, I think to be able to tell that story in a way that is universal, to be able, maybe not universal, but a way that's accessible, but then to also match it with data, because you can have the most beautiful story in the world and it might not necessarily resonate in the way we hope. But I think a really effective combination is having a few key points and then this really powerful testimony or experience. And I think that's what we don't hear enough of, whether it be in the medical field or all of these other fields. We need to hear from people that are actually experiencing it and living it. And I think that's why we were really excited to actually be here today and to keep working with patient advocates, because you have that voice. But I would like to sort of counterbalance that by saying it's still good to sort of think, again, anticipate what policymakers might want, and to really be ready and to focus on those key messages. That's a balance of storytelling and data. This was just another example of sort of partners, which was an example from when they were putting warning labels in Latin America that were putting warning about sugar and content for the first time. It was taking off in Mexico and Chile, and there was sort of a very interesting coalition of groups, including UNICEF, including local groups that were actually advocating for this. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of certain very involved civil society groups that actually ended up getting global recognition. And when a few countries started adopting it, including Chile and Mexico, it sort of spread. So that's another example of how advocacy can sort of spread. And I won't take too much time with this one, but again, I think sometimes we tend to not think about corporations, because we think, okay, health, don't want to talk to chocolate companies. We need to be dealing with the people on the ground. We don't want to be making coalitions with them. And this is not to say to compromise your morals, but we have to make unconventional coalitions to actually make some of these things work, right? So an example of this is actually coming from the cocoa farms. There are multiple more examples from all across sectors, but it's to say, don't necessarily rule people out. If you really want to have change, then you probably might have to talk to corporations. You might have to work with NGOs. There has to be this sort of cross-sectoral things, because governments, NGOs, companies, we all have responsibilities for these complex things, whether it be through more ethical cocoa that works on human rights, that works on environment, whether it be through health issues, where you have to work with insurance companies, with governments, with medical companies, with researchers. There's very few solutions that come from just us working by ourselves. So no matter what sector you're in, and I know it's a very diverse group today, which is amazing, but no matter what sector you're in, I would just urge you to think about sort of the ways you can collaborate with others. And yes, so that would be basically my takeaway from today. Yes, and I'm wrapping up, and then we will have a few time for questions, because I see that there's some questions in the chat. But again, meeting with partners, practice your empathy. It might sound really silly, and you might say, okay, we're super empathetic and we have the patient voice, so everyone should be listening. But at the end of the day, the other people are not necessarily coming at it from the same perspective. So you should always be asking yourself, for better or for worse, why should they care? Maybe I care a lot about my issues, but let's take it from an outside perspective. Do they care? Why should they care? Who's supporting who? I think it's always good to be able to sort of pull yourself out, to be able to actually sort of reflect on these things. And at the end of the day, it sounds very political, even though we're the good lobby, but it's always good to think, what can I do for them? It doesn't mean that it has to be something sort of nefarious, but, coming at it from an external perspective, is there something maybe I can amplify their cause? It's just a way to sort of think about things to move forward. So now I see there are definitely some questions up. And again, as I've already underlined, your patient advocates, it's amazing. I mean, this is why we love speaking at these things. You have a really unique perspective, but I think the takeaway is really to have this sort of human-centered, but also facts and data-centered idea, and then mainly to see the big picture, because we all get stuck in our silos. So I hope that some of the information that I've told you in very rapid succession has been helpful. I know it's been a lot, which is why I'm now seeing the questions in the chat. So we're going to take at least, the next 10, 12 minutes to try to dig into these. Yes, so I don't know, is it, yeah, so I'll leave this one on, and I'm seeing some questions in the chat, right? Okay. So have you ever encountered a very difficult leader while lobbying for a cause or purpose? How to overcome that? Yes. I mean, I think it's very hard to lobby. Sorry, I'm going to turn my light on. I'm in here. Yes, it's very hard to lobby without running into a difficult leader. And part of the way, I mean, if you're really lobbying effectively, it means you're talking to people on both sides of your cause, right? It's very rare that we lobby someone who's already fully in support. And how to overcome that, I would say, is the body of your research and how many sort of groups you can bring together. That's why I would say in the stakeholder mapping to focus on the middle. Again, let's take the plastics example. It's very unlikely if I'm working to have a single-use plastics ban, that I'm going to get a group like Coca-Cola 100% on board, right? But if there's someone sort of in the middle, and I come with a coalition with either an open letter or with a very driven campaign that has 10 different groups all in favor of the specific ban, you can probably get someone in the middle to come to your cause. So I would say aim first for the middle when it comes to difficult opponents. And if you have a truly difficult opponent that has a ton of power and is total stick in the mud, the media is a powerful tool. Again, it's better if you have a very broad range of allies, but if you can come together with some really sort of a bunch of names and start calling that person out, that can sometimes be effective. Again, it all needs to be fact-based. We can't just start pointing fingers at each other and saying, this guy doesn't support my cause, but there is power to having a well-planned coalition and calling someone out. I hope that was helpful. And then yes, to the next one. Do you see a time when lobbying will elevate to full collaboration? It seems to be more negotiation than collaboration. Yes. So again, coming back to sort of the definition of lobbying, right? The definition of lobbying is to persuade someone. So it's always at the end of the day probably going to have some element of negotiation. But I think it also links nicely to what I was saying, which is like you can collaborate to negotiate, right? Ideally, we all would. It's very rare that you're going to get your cause across the finish line with no collaboration. So I think we can all collaborate for good causes, and it may be in an ideal world, there would be less negotiation, there would be less people who are pushing back against your cause. If we can all band together and we have this amazing, multinational group that wants to push forward one cause, that's fantastic. But I don't think lobbying will ever really lose its negotiation aspect, because unfortunately, in the world we live in, there's always going to be somebody who's slightly opposing you. So it does tend to be a negotiation, but collaboration is essential. So I don't want to negate that. I would just say the two are sort of interacting. To be effective, how many issues should you focus on at once? This is a great question. I think too many groups tend to sort of dive into a ton of issues. My advice would be to really pick a very specific one and dive into that, because actual policy change is really complicated. And I think the more specific you are, the better you can make your coalition, the better you can map your issues. So the more specific, the better. And in some cases, you might be able to take that specific policy issue and maybe, expand it or grow it. But at the beginning, especially with limited resources, if you're sort of working with, very limited resources, the more specific, the better. It's very hard to go into something and say, I want to combat climate change, or I want to solve cardiovascular disease in Europe. That's not going to work, right? I think the more specific, the better would definitely be my advice on that. But that doesn't mean to necessarily limit yourself. You can also join coalitions with other groups who are working on broader issues. But I would say for targeting your policy, maybe more specific, the better. I see one person that's asking me to go back to empathy. And I think there's one or two questions about this. So yes, practicing empathy probably sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, because most of us, we're very empathetic or we're not. but I think there are ways to practice the way we pitch empathy to groups. Let's see if there's actually, I think this is the same question, but so how to build support among your own community, get people on board, engaged. I mean, among your own community, yeah, that's a great question. Because again, this is when we're in silos, we think that everyone's going to automatically engage with us. I think people tend to be very busy, as we all know, and people tend to be short on time. So getting people excited in our own community, whether that be the health community, whether that be the advocate community, whether it just be the community of families and loved ones who support you, but maybe they don't necessarily know exactly what you're talking about when it comes to a policy issue. I think one of the best ways is actually coming back to empathy. So, why should they be interested? Why should they care? I think a good way to pitch it is to approach them from this sort of place of empathy. So to say, here's something I'm really passionate about. And then to also pitch it in a way that says, here's my policy goal. Here's my story. Here's what I'm trying to change. And to contextualize. It doesn't mean you have to show up again with 800 pages of data. Odds are, if they're in your community, they might already know a lot of the struggles. So this is a good moment to also tailor your audience and think, why are they maybe not supporting me, especially in my own community? Is it a family member that maybe, loves me a lot, but they don't totally understand the health aspects? In which case I would say, is there a way to show them some of these health issues, maybe a little bit more ways to show some of the long-term data or my own well-being? Is it someone who's in my own community and is also a patient, but they're just tired of politics, which is understandable? Then I would try to approach them in a different way. I would show them my policy goal and maybe these are these other groups that support me. So again, there's no one size fit all, but I think definitely approaching it from a place of asking myself, why should they be interested? Where are they coming from? And yeah, tailoring that to whatever the group may be, whether they're in your community or not your community, asking yourself, why do they feel like this? And why, if I was them, should I care? That probably seems really simplistic, and I could probably give another, 3-hour conversation, but coming from a place of, honestly, I'm a pretty empathetic person, and I work on cases where, my parents don't know what I'm doing. No one knows what I'm doing, but I try to put myself in their shoes and tailor it to that. Okay, there's a lot of different questions, so I'll try to get through this. So, the COVID was only a stress test of the healthcare system. Yes, we must solve the global health crisis. Absolutely. And yes, totally agree. Doctors, healthcare professionals, patients, added value. So do we need the politicians? I'm glad someone asked this. Because yes, this is exactly what I was talking about when some people are burnt out, and I totally understand. I mean, sometimes I'm like, do we need politics? I mean, we're all very tired, I think, at this point, sometimes of politics. But my resounding answer to we need the healthcare professionals and the patients and all of these things, we do still need politicians. I will say that with my full heart. It doesn't mean that I love it. It doesn't mean that I wake up every morning and I'm super excited to see what politicians are doing. But it's very, very, very difficult to get anywhere with no politicians, especially on issues that are technical. You can have the best doctors in the world. You can have the best patient advocates in the world, but they are being shaped by the policy environment, and they're shaping politicians, right? I mean, those groups have active interest, especially groups that are working in different medical aspects, to work with politicians. So there's no world we're living in where this is going to be depoliticized. There's no world where we're going to have a depoliticized healthcare system. So for better or worse, and no matter how tired we are, we need the politicians. And I would also underline that we need businesses, which is something that people often forget, maybe not in the medical field, but in other fields. There's just no way we're going to solve these very complex systems issues without working with all parties involved. And unless we're going to take, a totally privatized non-governmental healthcare system, which I think I would urge against, and would produce a whole mess of stakeholders, we do unfortunately need politicians, which is why we unfortunately need advocates and lobbyists and people like us who are active with politicians. So I'm sorry if that's not the easy answer, but I can't emphasize it enough. We definitely need to interact with politicians, which is why we need the tools. Okay, we have like a few more questions. I'm going to answer one that says, you've talked about human stories and arguments, but what about cost arguments? Are they just important? Cost arguments are very important. They're very important to a certain on two levels, right? Because there's the cost arguments for patients and for the people that are paying the cost, which is, when you're talking about political issues, there's a very real cost argument for voters. is one of our political things going to raise the cost slightly of health insurance or slightly of paying things? So there's the cost you absorb as a voter, and then there's the cost, of course, to businesses and to the groups that are working in those. And both of those are very important. Yes, I'll be super fast. So they're very important, but there's something that I would take into account into my research and my stakeholder mapping to say who cares about the cost most. If I pass this certain thing that either makes medication, less expensive for the consumer, but more expensive for the politician, I would think about that in terms of your broader policy. Of course, money is always the issue, but it's also linked to other things. And I wouldn't make it your full argument, because I think that's actually why there are tons of people that can walk into a room and talk about the cost, right? But what you have and what we have as advocates and as people who are engaged is to show the sides of things that are not just money. There's tons of economists or business people that can walk into a room. So yes, it's extremely important, and it's one reason you map your environment. But I think what we need to do is take the conversation away from just money. And I'm really sorry we don't have any more time. I'm going to pass the ball to Neil in a moment, but I will urge you, I'll go back to the slide that I have and we'll share these slides that has my contact information. We're always happy to be in touch with people. So if one of these sort of got you burning with passion about one of these questions and you'd like to reach out to hear more, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're super happy to hear from you. And I was really happy to see all the questions. I hope we could answer some of them.
Thank you very much to you, Kelsey. Also to Alberto and Sarah, who've supported you with this session. I think it was a really, really interesting discussion. What struck me especially was the multiple role of lobbying as a legitimizer, a mobilizer, an equalizer, and also its fundamental role in democracy. And perhaps in this climate, it's never been so important, but also how this is so relevant for the CV community. I really liked those 10 key elements of the toolkit, and I'm sure that's going to be an excellent resource in moving forward once the summit has finished and people think about what they can actually do in practical terms. And of course, it's on the Unite Summit platform.